Of the 6 members of the research team who volunteered to monitor Earth, I believe I am the only one who remains sane, Locke stated, his long-fingered hands folded neatly on the cold metal table. Of course, Agitok is expected to recover, so that number might soon increase to 2. Is that enough of a qualification for you? The 2 members of the Spinward Alliance sent to interview Locke exchanged puzzled glances before turning their attention back to him. Locke didn't know who they were, but he certainly knew what they were. The first, and evidently the one in charge, was one of the burly Goo, a hairy, physically powerful race whose beastly appearance belied their frighteningly keen intellect. The command crest he bore indicated a surprisingly high rank, a promising sign. Perhaps Locke's warnings might be taken seriously after all. He had anticipated this visit. One doesn't write a report like his without expecting some sort of follow-up from the powers that be. The second member was one of the thin, reedy Familian, arguably the only race in the Alliance less physically imposing than Locke's species, the Talons. Locke could never tell the Familian apart. They seemed to him little more than noodle-like tendrils, studded with sensory organs stuffed into Alliance uniforms. Understand, Seeker Locke, that as a matter of course we need to establish why your somewhat distressing report should be given due consideration. This is all being recorded, you know, the Goo stated, gesturing to his partner, who held up a recording spool already whirring with activity. Please state your qualifications. At moments like these, Locke wished he could roll his eyes like humans do, but the large black ovals on his face remained motionless. This was all going to be by the book. Not a good sign. Very well. I am Seeker Trachis La'ok, 2nd rank, assigned to the observation vessel GG, which in turn was tasked with evaluating the 3rd planet from the Sun in the Sol system, commonly known as Earth, La'ok said. May I at least get the courtesy of an introduction before we begin? Of course, and for the record as well, the Goo responded, placing a thick hand on his barrel-like chest. I am Special Investigator Syak, 1st rank. I am accompanied by my assistant, Investigator Lug, 5th rank. Now then. Which office sent you? Locke inquired. A 1st rank was a very promising sign, but protocol should have required him to announce his specific assignment. That information does not need to be entered into the record, Syak replied curtly. A very bad sign indeed. Have my recommendations been seen by the ruling council yet? Locke asked, trying to gauge the seriousness of the situation. Or by Alliance command? Seeker Locke, I find it very hard to believe that a planet that hasn't even developed hyperspace travel could pose the threat you describe in your report. If I'm not convinced, I'm not going to waste the time of those above me with it, Syak said, folding his clawed hands on the table. If you want your report to go to anyone above me, you'll need to be quite convincing. With that, Syak reached out and activated a metal sphere on the table. It hummed to life, emitting a holographic projection of several charts and data streams. It is our understanding that the Terrian technocracy began observing this planet quite some time ago. Several thousand years, I believe. The Vitan invasion of 4040 destroyed a great deal of our records. But yes, we believe that to be about right, Locke confirmed. The ruling council has always had an odd interest in the planet. Speculation on that ranges from long-term genetic experimentation to considerations of annexation. When the old council died and the new one took their place, half the reason we were assigned to the planet was to discover why the past regime was so heavily invested in it. And do you have an opinion on that interest? Syak asked. After what I've seen, I think some of them had an inkling of what the humans might be capable of should they reach their current level of development, La'ok replied. And what level is that currently? Syak pressed. The species is currently experiencing their first forays into fusion and nuclear power. They've developed early-stage AI and are rapidly advancing in robotics. But none of that is particularly notable, Locke said, his voice steady. What's truly interesting is their global communication network, a system they call the Internet. Internet? What's special about it? Does it transmit data unusually fast or efficiently? Is it particularly robust or resistant to infrastructure damage? Syak asked, now paying just a bit more attention to Locke. The core union's data saboteurs have been relentless in their attacks on our networks. Any improvements to our cyber defenses would be valuable. Oh, it's nothing special technologically, Locke replied, shaking his head. Just a primitive array of computational machines all linked through cables, satellites, and transmitters. What's interesting is how the humans have integrated it. Integrated it? Sayak leaned forward, intrigued. Locke nodded. Information networks are nothing new. Every species in the Alliance has them, and so do those ravenous beasts in the core union. We send and receive research data, military reports, general news. We pool the knowledge of 100 worlds to accelerate our research and keep our population safe and informed. Humans do that too to some extent, but they seem to have a different primary use for their network. Sayak frowned. And what would that be? What do they use it for then? Have you ever heard of a meme? Locke asked. A what? It's difficult to define. Locke paused, tapping the table with a long gray finger as he searched for the right words. It's like a mind virus, I suppose. They're beginning to develop psionics? Kayak asked, his expression darkening. Locke shook his head. No, nothing like that. A meme can be a picture, but sometimes it's a song or a phrase. It's a thought that grips the mind, sometimes just a memory. It spreads quickly, mutating as it goes. You take the meme into your head, and then you start seeing it everywhere. It's better to show you the effects of memes on our minds than the memes themselves. Locke hesitated, then continued. Let me show you what's happened to the other members of the team. The Burim Institute was the finest mental recovery facility in the Tarian technocracy, but its sheer size made the journey from the low-security wing, where Locke was recovering, to the high-security wing, where his comrades were held, a tedious process. Sayak's credentials got them through multiple security checkpoints, but the time it took was still irritating to both Locke and his interrogators. Finally, they arrived at the first of Locke's surviving team members, who was lazily sitting in his padded cell, appearing perfectly serene. His institute jumpsuit hung loosely on his frail frame, even by Tarian standards. He's not dangerous, Locke said as the three entered the cell. He's here only as a precaution and for isolation. We're worried that repeated exposure to him could be mentally infectious. Locke turned to the skinny gray alien. Hello, Vic. How are you today? Cooked. Absolutely cooked, Vic mumbled. It's so over. Tried to flex on the nurse with my skibbity riz, but she told me I was tweaking. Told her I stand for how G her cranium is, but my vibe check got ratioed. Just a big oof. Kayak frowned, reaching up to adjust the metal circlet around his head. Hang on, there's something wrong with my translator. Locke sighed, shaking his head. There's nothing wrong with your translator. Ever since coming back from his last info dive into the human internet, Vic has been talking like this. Locke tilted his head, trying to interpret. I think he just said he hit on the nurse and she rejected him. Rejected? Terrans are a race of clones with no... Well, I thought your kind didn't engage in such behavior, Kayak said, confused. We don't. But humans do, Locke explained. He turned back to Vic and spoke louder. Vic, you're a Terran. Terrans don't reproduce through pair bonding. Vic scowled, his thin lips curling. Cringe. That's so last year. When I'm done look-smaxing my aura, it'll be so peak I'll Netflix and chill with that girl boss. No cap. What's wrong with him? Kayak asked, frustration creeping into his voice. Why can't he communicate normally? It's the memes, Locke sighed. They've infested his brain. When he tries to speak, he can't help but let them out. He might even believe he's part human now. I have a human persona, Vic mumbled. Not like you basic jits. Sayak towered over the little alien. What does that even mean? How did you get like this, little Terran? What did you see? Got a rare invite for a lit net party that made me the main character, Vic said before breaking into a fit of giggles. You give off such NPC energy. Speak normally, Sayak growled, his patience wearing thin. Investigator, please. He can't. Locke tried to place a calming hand on Kayak's arm, but the goo immediately shook him off. Speak, normally, Kayak demanded again. Sussy NPC here, about to act out of pocket, Vic mumbled before Kayak, in a flash of anger, grabbed him by the shoulders and hoisted him into the air. Speak, Sayak shouted, shaking the little gray humanoid roughly. Vic's oversized head lolled around on his neck like a jellied noodle. When it rolled around to face Kayak, he simply grinned. "Okay, Boomer." Sayak's claws extended, his arm drawing back for a blow that never came, as Laok and Lug both pulled him back. Their combined strength wasn't enough to hold him off, of course, but it was enough to make him snap back to his senses. Kayak retracted his claws and unceremoniously dropped the insane Tarian to the floor. "I have no idea why that was so enraging, but it was," Kayak admitted as Laok guided the group out of the cell, which automatically locked behind them. "It seems to have that effect on people," Laok said, shaking his head. "That's one of the reasons he was confined to the cell. Though I have to admit, I've never seen it work so quickly before. Perhaps the Gulans have a vulnerability to the meme's after effects. Or perhaps we simply do not suffer fools as easily as the Terrans," Kayak replied, a hint of frustration in his voice. "So this is what you were worried about? Some sort of gibberish language that affects the behavior of those exposed to it?" Kayak asked, clearly unimpressed. "If only that was all," Locke responded, sighing. "That was just one form of meme. There are others, each with different effects. Nap is just down the hall. He's been coating the walls of his cell with drawings, non-stop since returning. The words he uses are fine, but it's the subjects that are concerning. He won't stop talking about fictional alien women. He calls them his waifus, from stories mentioned on the internet. You see, it's not just the memes, but what birthed them. The Earthlings' culture." "Culture?" Sayak sniffed dismissively. "What does that have to do with anything?" "Everything," Laok said emphatically. "Culture is an afterthought to most of us in the Alliance, even more so for the core Union. We've put all our energies into pulling apart the mysteries of the universe, developing machines based on the secrets we learn, and of course, fighting each other. The humans do all of that, certainly, but they've also put immense energy into turning inward, into pulling themselves apart, examining the pieces, and sometimes just playing with those pieces." "Playing with the pieces?" Kayak echoed, still skeptical. "They think about what can't be instead of what is." "Exactly. The number of human stories, pieces of art, and songs in their network is astounding, far in excess of the cultural output of the rest of the Alliance combined. Not all of it is so introspective, but much of it is, even if the creators didn't intend it to be. So much of the human race looks inward, while we of the Spinward Alliance have been looking outward. It's fascinating." "Perhaps, but it seems to me like you're describing a massive waste of energy," Kayak said, frowning. "What does all this introspection gain them?" "Well, clearly it gains them something," Locke replied. "If just brushing against their collected culture does all of this to an observation team. What we saw in their network was so complex, so imaginative. It ensnared all of our minds. Pure imagination, not constrained by science, war, or external purposes. Imagination for its own sake. I suppose you might even call them dreams. Something the advanced species of the Alliance and the depraved monsters of the core gave up on a long time ago. Forgive me, Honored Seeker, but I find it difficult to accept that something as pure as dreams turned a Terran into that thing I almost strangled," Kayak said, his skepticism still evident. Locke smiled thinly. "A child's dreams are still dreams, though they may be wiser and often vulgar. Such was what consumed Vic. Pure irreverence and the desire to twist things into parody, among other things. I believe humans call it brain rot. It can get worse too. Let me show you the fate of Garrick and Agitok," Laok said, gesturing down the hall. "This way, gentle beings." Garrick didn't react to the three entering the small recreation hall at first because he was too busy arguing with Agitok. Both Terrans were seated across from each other at one of the many small tables in the hall. But rather than playing a game of Goram or indulging in a few stim spheres, Agitok and Garrick were just yelling at each other. "No, Star Wars lore is," Garrick howled, shaking with intensity. Garrick slammed his spindly limbs on the table in frustration. "Why even tell a story if you're just going to go back and change everything whenever you please?" "Maybe because half of the old canon was garbage," Agitok shot back, arms crossed as he leaned back in his metal chair. "Superweapon after superweapon. aliens with living spaceships, and aliens that asterisk were asterisk living spaceships. The key in trilogy was asterisk cinematic gold asterisk. Don't give me that. Your stupid movies killed Han Solo, and your stupid books killed Chewbacca, Garrick retorted bitterly. So did yours, Agitok countered. Kayak leaned down to whisper to Laok, his confusion evident. What in the Inferus are they talking about? A human cultural saga, Laok replied quietly. It's vast, split into hundreds of smaller parts and stories. Garrick and Agitok became obsessed with it after noticing how often it was referenced and how many memes it generated. They thought that by understanding it, they could better understand the humans. Now it's practically all they talk about. Locke cleared his throat and stepped forward. Hello, Garrick. Hello, Agitok. The two immediately stopped their squabbling, turning towards their visitors. Oh, hello, Locke, Garrick said, his tone suddenly pleasant. Where have you been? I just came from visiting Vic, Locke said. His recovery is not going well. Poor Vic, Agitok said, his anger forgotten in an instant. Even we heard a little about his attempts to court in the style of the Earthlings. That feel when no goth girlfriend, Garrick said with a nod, his expression somber. We sympathize. Who are your new friends? Agitok asked, nodding to Kayak and Lug. They're representatives from the Alliance who have come to check in on us, Locke explained. Do you think you can tell them a little about the mission? Mission? You mean Mission Vao? Garrick began, but Locke let out a pained groan and cut him off. No, our mission. The one that brought us to Earth, Locke clarified. Do you remember anything about the mission yet? Of course we remember the mission, Agitok said, though his confidence wavered. We started our info dive shortly after Vic came back, all giddy and giggling. He started making all these nonsensical jokes, which he said were references. References to what? Kayak asked. So we hooked ourselves up and began. Agitok started, but then he trailed off, his words becoming slow and laborious. Garrick suddenly giggled. Always two there are, a master and an apprentice. When we arrived in orbit, I was but the learner. Now I am the master, Agitok continued, parroting Garrick's words with a vacant look. Learner? Kayak asked, leaning forward. You mean someone taught you all this? Did you make direct contact with the Earthlings? It's just a form of Earth joke, Locke explained quickly. You twist the words from a fictional scene to fit whatever you're talking about. Anyone else who's seen the fiction will understand you, leaving others confused. Agitok and Garrick slip into this kind of talk for hours now. Like I said, different from Vic, but possibly worse. So to understand them, you have to watch? Kayak said, struggling with the concept. The piece they're referring to is a movie, Locke clarified. Yes, you have to watch the fiction to fully understand them. I can manage to partially understand just by repetition and context clues, Locke said. But then you'd end up like they are, obsessed. Observe, Locke said, turning to Garrick. Garrick, what city hive did you grow up in? City hive? You mean Hive City? That's a 40K thing, not my speed, Garrick replied. Agitok shook his head. What's Coruscant then? A humanopolis, right? That's the same thing, but fancier, you nerf herder. Exactly my point. Fancier, Agitok snapped back as the two began to argue again. Loic turned back to Kayak. He can't even answer simple questions about himself anymore. All he remembers is the cultural information he got from the internet. Garrick and Agitok were stern, serious scientists before the mission to Earth. Now they spend all their time arguing about things that don't actually exist. How long did it take for them to be affected by the network? Kayak asked, his tone growing more serious. Loic turned back to look at Garrick and Agitok, who were still deep in their heated argument. One day, he finally said, it only took 1 day of dedicated info diving to push them past the point of no return. Just 3 more days, and they degenerated into this. Kayak glanced at the two aliens, now more concerned than before. Is there even a point to us being here? Can they answer any actual questions for us? Questions? No, Locke replied, shaking his head. But that's the point I wanted to make. Now imagine this same affliction spreading throughout an entire starship crew. At best, you'd have the crew bogged down by petty arguments every 20 minutes. At worst, they'd completely forget how to do their jobs because their memories melted away, replaced by obscure details of random earthling fiction. Syak listened in on the argument between Garrick and Agitok. The new X-Wing design is 0 out of 10. Would not fly, Garrick argued passionately. You couldn't even fly a Y-Wing, Agitok shot back. My fist is going to fly into your face if you badmouth the workhorse of the rebellion one more time. I'm beginning to see your point, Kayak admitted, his skepticism starting to fade. Locke nodded. Good. All right then, he said, turning back to his old friends with a note of regret in his voice. It's time to go. Goodbye, Garrick. Goodbye, Agitok. I'll visit again soon. As Lao guided Syak and Lug to the door, Agitok and Garrick suddenly fixed him with fierce scowls. No, Garrick said in an affected tone of menace. No, you will asterisk by asterisk. The two Terrans shook their hands at Laok as if they were shooting something from their fingers, then burst into laughter and waved. Laok offered them a weak smile in return and hastened to leave. He led Syak and Lug outside the room, carefully locking the door behind him. Turning to the two, he wore a sad smile. Do you see now why I wrote what I wrote? Do you see how Earth can be a danger despite not having modern technology or FTL travel? Locke asked. I do see why you would make such a report now, Kayak said, crossing his bulky arms. But I don't agree with it. I think seeing the effect the planet's information network has had on your comrades has caused you to lose your objectivity. When encountering something dangerous, some losses are always to be expected from first contact. This is no different, Kayak explained. The second team will go in better prepared and with forewarning. Some measures need to be taken, surely. Perhaps limiting exposure, having onboard mental experts, psionics. Something along those lines. But the recommendations you've outlined in your report are simply too extreme. Until we know more, there's no reason to implement a quarantine on the system. And to be frank, I think it would just invite more scrutiny. I just don't think the danger is as big as you say. After all, you came out of it sane. There has to be a way to replicate that. Once we do, we'll have an effective countermeasure that will allow us to continue our studies safely. You still think that after seeing all of this? Laok asked bitterly. Then let me make my own addition. Let me tell you about my own experience with the Earthlings' internet. Lok paused, collecting his thoughts before continuing. Unlike the others, I decided to start with a number of databases connected to the network. I was immediately impressed by the amount of information freely accessible. Unlike our own networks, you didn't need to be a certain rank or class to access most of it. It was just there, waiting to be absorbed. I'm a seeker, Kayak. What else could I do when presented with such unguarded treasure but try to plunder it all? I immersed myself, reading article after article, following link after link on subject after subject. It felt like I was learning more and more, but somehow learning nothing at the same time. Time fell apart. I spent hours just wandering. Locke's voice grew quiet, almost wistful. It was beautiful. My own identity vanished, and I became just a receptacle for an endless stream of information. Only when the pain in my stomach became biting did I realize that I'd done nothing but wander the internet for days. By that time, my comrades were already beginning to display how much the Earth's networks had affected them. Even as I watched them argue, spout gibberish, and ignore their duties, all I wanted was to quickly quell my biological needs so I could reconnect and continue my journey. What were you reading that had you so enthralled? More fictions? Kayak asked. No, and that's the point. It's not just human stories that have this pull, but poetry, music, art. Even their history can have this irresistible draw if presented a certain way. Do you see what I'm saying? No subject matter is safe on that damn network. It can all lead into madness. He paused, a reflective look crossing his small face. The Earthlings have a phrase for it, you know, he said, folding his hands behind his back. Going down the rabbit hole. They've adapted to it, you see. Most of them can surf this sea of information for hours and come back to reality all smiles. We can't. Our brains aren't built for it, Locke admitted. I'm not sure of the exact mechanics behind it, but it's like this. Think of humans as cups that dip into the sea, play with the water, then dump it back. None the worse for wear. But when a Terrian tries that, we sink below the waves because we can't stop trying to put the whole sea in our cup, even if it's impossible. And what happens to something that sinks in the sea? It becomes part of that sea. Our brains are wired to hyper-focus on tasks, so when we're exposed to the vast hub of information the humans have, it's inevitable that one of our kind finds something to latch onto, perhaps even to obsess over. The humans are more flexible in their thoughts. Perhaps this trait is intentional, some sort of defense? Kayak asked. I don't think so, Locke replied, shaking his head. There are cases of similar things happening to humans. It's just very rare. I think their thought patterns are simply too complex. They layer meaning upon meaning. Hardly anything is just as it appears. As far as I can tell, the only reason they don't have technology on par, or better than the rest of us, is that they spend so much time dealing with their own minds. They ask so many questions that can never be answered and dream so many dreams that can never be. It's like an endless cycle of thoughts blooming into new thoughts, like a fractal tree endlessly growing. That's very poetic, Kayak remarked, leaning back in his chair. But if the Earthlings have that much potential, surely you can see how it would be to our advantage to contact them first? We have plenty of technologies we could trade for their service in the war. Imagine if we could find a way to weaponize these memes, this culture of theirs. It would be a way to fight without fighting. A fool's errand, Locke spat. How do you think half of my crew went mad? Everyone who kept their sanity after the initial info dives was thinking of one way or another to turn this to our advantage. Garrick had the idea of taking that damned movie of his and sending copies to the core union before it consumed him. Vic was working on a selection of particularly disruptive music that could be broadcast over enemy communication channels. It's not worth it. But what if... Lugg spoke up for the first time since the meeting began, his voice high-pitched and reedy. Layok instantly disliked him. What if the core union finds out about Earth and approaches them with a deal first? Imagine what our enemies could do if they managed to ally with those strange creatures. We should be so lucky to have the core union squander its scouts on something impossibly insane, Locke replied. Now consider this, he said, tenning his fingers. Earth did all of this without meaning to, without even knowing it was being watched. Can you imagine what Earth would be capable of if it only knew the power it had? What they could do if they knew we were out here vulnerable to them? Sayek stared into Laok's unblinking eyes. So that is why you made such recommendations, he finally said after a long pause. You think the real threat isn't someone reaching the humans and using them, but the humans themselves becoming a new power? It's very possible, Locke replied. I'll remind you that they went from steam power to space travel in less than 300 years. FTL is still a distant dream for them, but it won't be nearly as distant if some curious ship picks up a signal and crashes after the crew's brains get scrambled. Layok looked at Kayak steadily. It's not that the humans aren't ready for us. It's that we aren't ready for the humans. We need time. We need to be cautious. We need to study. My poor comrades, and yourself as well, Kayak pointed out. Laok winced. Yes, and myself too, he admitted. I'm not sure why I was able to break free of human culture when my team was not. I like to think it was my superior intellect and will, but Agitok was my better in both, and still he failed. Maybe it was just chance, or maybe it's some trait I overlooked in my analysis. Does it matter right now? No. No matter how you look at it, we need more time. You might have a point, Kayak said, reappraising the little Terrian. You do realize that if we follow your advice and are discovered, we risk causing the very conflict you fear? I have contingencies in mind for such an event, Locke said. I'm more concerned about keeping any of our own citizens well away from the planet. We Terrans cling to order, but I understand some in the Alliance are more adventurous. Not to worry, Kayak said, grinning sharply. I have an idea for that. Fear not, little seeker, you've convinced me. I'll carry your recommendations to the ruling council myself, though how many of your recommendations they'll take is beyond my ability to guess. Praise be, Special Investigator, Locke said, breathing out slowly in relief. I'm confident the council will make the right choice. We've watched humans for thousands of years. We can stand to watch for 1,000 more until we find a way to protect ourselves from them. If you look at Ton star charts, you won't find any mention of the Sol system, nor even its closest neighbors such as Alpha Centauri or Sirius. That area of space is completely dark, with the official explanation being that a supermassive black hole was unexpectedly discovered and slowly devoured all the systems around it. As such, that area of space was put under strict quarantine. Of course, there are those among the Tans who insist that the gravitational readings from that sector of space simply do not support the existence of any black hole, much less a supermassive one. These Tans are labeled malcontents and conspiracy theorists, the feeble-minded wishing to believe in ghost stories that drift around that sector like mist. Stories about a species so powerful that their mere thoughts warp the minds of those around them. Rumors and myths float around the deepest parts of the city hives concerning transmissions caught by wandering satellites and quickly covered up. Rumors about top-secret dissections performed with dread of the retaliation that might come should they ever be discovered. But those are all just stories for the gullible. After all, who could believe that humans actually exist? This concludes our exploration into the unknown dangers of human culture. If this tale of alien intrigue and the unpredictable power of imagination made you question what's truly out there, show your support by leaving a like. Comment with the word caution if you believe in the careful study of new encounters. And don't forget to subscribe if you value stories that delve into the mysterious and the unexpected. Your engagement helps us continue uncovering these fascinating tales. Thank you for joining us on this thought-provoking journey.